Hi GOR, so this is Unit 3B, Lesson 6, and today we're going to practice all of our parallelograms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make like a little family tree of our parallelograms. The top of this is a parallelogram. Alright, so this is my parallelogram, and I'm going to write down my properties next to it. So hopefully you know these properties. Just by looking at the picture, you can see that opposite sides are congruent and parallel. So I'm just using my symbols for congruent and parallel. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles, those are the ones that are next to each other. Consecutive angles are supplementary, they equal 180. And the diagonals bisect each other. So if you have these properties and you have a problem, you can figure out the problem based on these properties. Now, underneath a parallelogram, off to the left, I'm going to have my rectangles. Sorry about the dog. So the rectangle is over here. Now, a rectangle is a parallelogram, but remember, a rectangle has right angles, and the rectangle also has congruent diagonals. So it has all of the properties I already have listed, plus it has two more. I'm only going to list the extra ones. It has all right angles, and it has the diagonals are congruent. That's the big one that's usually tested. Okay? And then off to the right, I have my rhombus. Shh. Okay, so my rhombus is over here. A rhombus is a parallelogram also. So it has all the properties of a parallelogram, plus it has all sides congruent. I already marked that on the picture. The diagonals are perpendicular. That's probably the one that is more important. And the diagonals also bisect the angles. That comes up sometimes. That means they cut the angles in half. And then if you sort of put the rectangle and the rhombus together, you have a square. A square is still a parallelogram. These are all parallelograms. A square has all right angles, all congruent sides. The diagonals are congruent. The diagonals bisect each other. The diagonals is a big thing that's always tested, but the square basically has all the properties. So the reason that I drew it like this is the parallelograms at the top. All of these underneath it are parallelograms. So a rectangle is a parallelogram. A parallelogram doesn't have to be a rectangle, though. It's only a rectangle if the diagonals are congruent. A rhombus is a parallelogram, but a parallelogram isn't a rhombus unless all the sides are congruent to each other. So anything below is what's true above. A square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square unless all the sides are congruent. So we're going to look at some true-false questions, all right, and then we will practice some more tomorrow. The quadrilaterals at the bottom have all of the properties of the figures listed above it. Based on this diagram, determine if the following are true or false. If it's false, explain why. So if you want to pause the video and try this, that would be great. So first question, all rectangles are parallelograms. Well, let's look, is a rectangle a parallelogram? To be a parallelogram, you have to have opposite sides parallel. Does a rectangle have opposite sides parallel? It sure does. Plus, we also said that anything underneath has all the properties of the figure above it. So a rectangle parallelogram? Absolutely. Are rhombuses rectangles? Well, rectangles have right angles. Do rhombuses have right angles? They do not. So this would be false. All rhombuses are parallelograms. Again, to be a parallelogram, you just need opposite sides parallel. Does a rhombus have opposite sides parallel? Yes, it does. All parallelograms are rectangles. Well, a rectangle has right angles. Do all parallelograms have right angles? They do not. Oops, sorry about that. So all parallelograms are rectangles is false. Why? They don't have to have right angles. And the same reason for 2. I didn't write the reason. They don't have right angles. All squares are rectangles. A rectangle has right angles. Does a square have right angles? It sure does. All rectangles are squares. No, a square has to have all sides congruent. A rectangle does not. So this would be false. Doesn't have to have all sides congruent.